Joshua 24 and the first 15 verses. It says this. Then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. He summoned the elders, leaders, judges, and officials of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your forefathers, including Terah, the father of Abram, and Nahor, lived beyond the river and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the river and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. I assigned the hill country of Seir to Esau, but Jacob and his sons went down to Egypt. Then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I afflicted the Egyptians by what I did there, and I brought you out. And when I brought your fathers out of Egypt, you came to the sea, and the Egyptians pursued them with chariots and horsemen as far as the Red Sea. But they cried to the Lord for help, and he put darkness between you and the Egyptians. He brought the sea over them and covered them. You saw with your own eyes what I did to the Egyptians, and then you lived in the desert for a long time. I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived east of the Jordan. They fought against you, but I gave them into your hands. I destroyed them before you, and you took possession of their land. When Balak, son of Zippor, the king of Moab, prepared to fight against Israel, he sent for Balaam, son of Beor, to put a curse on you, but I would not listen to Balaam. So he blessed you again and again, and I delivered you out of his hand. Then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho, and the citizens of Jericho fought against you, as did also the Amorites, Perizzites, Canaanites, Hittites and Girgashites, Hivites and Jebusites, but I gave them into your hands. I sent the hornet ahead of you, which drove them out before you. Also the 2 Amorite kings, you did not do it with your own sword and bow. So I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build, and you live in them, and eat from vineyards and oil groves that you did not plant. Now fear the Lord, and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your forefathers worshipped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your forefathers served beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I might need that back again now. Thanking you. Let's just pray, shall we? Before we think a little bit about that passage. Father, thank you. Thank you for your word, for the stories that it contains of ordinary people encountering you in your power, in your majesty, and your holiness. Thank you for the ways in which we can see you partnering with people just like us. People who don't always get it right. People who often say things and then do something completely different. But Father, as we come to think about this passage we've heard this morning, by your Holy Spirit, open our ears and our eyes and our hearts, that your word might find a resting place within each one of us, that it would not return to you empty, but achieve all that you have purposed it to achieve, for the glory of your holy name. Amen. Now, I don't know about you, but life is full of choices, isn't it? Do you not think it's full of choices? I think it is. And Ian will attest to the fact that I sometimes find that a bit difficult. If you go to a restaurant and you're given a menu, and they say, oh, you know, do you need a little extra time? The answer to that question is always yes. Because I look at it and I think, if only I could just have a stomach big enough to have everything on the menu, then I'd work out which one I really wanted. But you have to make choices, don't you? And sometimes the way that we make choice, it's difficult to make a choice because there's so many things to choose from. You know, some time ago, our home church in Clare in Suffolk called a youth worker to come along and work with the youth leaders and the youth within the church. And George had come really well, highly recommended from his church community in Kenya. It was his first time out of Africa, his first time overseas. And he was going to be with us for a whole year. And for 6 months of that year, he lived with my parents. And our kids were small at the time, so we were only just down the road. So we got to know George really well. And I always remember the story my mum told about when she went to Sainsbury's with George. He'd said he'd come and help her do the shopping. So they went into Sainsbury's, and we all knew he loved ice cream. And she said, if you go to the freezer aisle, George, pick the ice cream that you'd like. And he was gone for ages. And she thought she'd lost him. And she went to the freezer aisle, and he was nowhere to be seen. She found him in the margarine aisle, because what had happened was George had gone to the ice cream aisle, and he'd realised that there was far more ice cream in one place than he'd ever seen before. And he was completely bamboozled by the choice that he had. He couldn't make a choice. There was just so much. And then all of a sudden it dawned on him that was probably the same for everything in this shop. And in the margarine aisle, he was just there saying to people, look how many margarines there are to choose from. Look, isn't it amazing? Where I come from, you just go in and say, I want ice cream, and they just go, it's there. Look at this choice. And I remember her saying, we were in the shop for far too long, and we came back with more ice cream than it really is possible for anybody to eat within a week, or a month, or a year even, because he just found it so difficult to make a choice. Our lives are full of choices that need to be made. And we make many of them every day without thinking about it. Some of them have far-reaching consequences, and others seem to be of absolutely no consequence at all. But I think it's true to say that the choices we make determine the character and the direction of our living. I mean, if you want to live well tomorrow, you probably ought to be making some decent choices today. Learning to choose well is important. Now, Joshua, I reckon, is a bloke well qualified when it comes to making choices and knowing how to make good choices. Remember, Joshua was born in Egypt. He was around when Pharaoh had this choice to let the people go, but chose not to. So Joshua lived through the plagues that beset the land of Egypt. Joshua was around when the people of Israel had the choice to listen to Moses and sacrifice the lamb and put the blood on their doorposts or not to. And because his family chose to, he was still walking around living and breathing as the firstborn. Joshua had been allowed partway up Mount Sinai when the covenant was confirmed. You read about it in Exodus 24 if you haven't got to that bit in your Old Testament reading yet. That's for you to look forward to. And so he was able to see for himself up close what happened when bad choices were made. He'd have seen the fallout from the golden calf incident. And please remember that when Joshua was sent as one of the 12 spies into the land of Canaan, only he and Caleb came back with favourable reports saying, it's a cracking land. We need to go in and do all that God's asked us to do. And the other 10 went, oh, it's terrible. The people are big. It's terrible. It's frightening. We won't be able to do it. And stirred up such unrest that the people didn't do what God had asked them to do. And Joshua lived with the consequence of that decision that was against what he thought, against what he'd said, and they wandered around for 40 years. I mean, not many of us have to put up with 40 years of bad decision, the consequences of it, but he did. You see, Joshua knew the power of living with the consequences of good and bad choices. And isn't this really probably what's behind the success of the Jericho mission? God tells him exactly what he is to do and promises that if he obeys and does it, Jericho will fall into their hands. So Joshua has to choose, what is he going to do? Is he going to obey and follow through with this slightly strange ritual of marching around an impenetrable city wall in silence for 6 days and then 7 times on the 7th day with the priests going crazy on the trumpets? Or is he going to ignore that because that does seem rather ridiculous and they would have been really ridiculed for doing it and try and sort it out himself? And of course we know what he chooses. Why? Because he knows the importance of making a good choice. He knows how to make good choices, even when they seem crazy. By the time we get to this passage we've heard this morning, Joshua 24, Joshua has spent 40 years in Egypt as a slave. He spent 40 years wandering around in the desert. He spent about 30 years in the promised land enjoying peace, enjoying prosperity, enjoying rest from his enemies. So we're getting on a bit now, Joshua. He's about 110. And he knows he is soon going to die. And he gathers the leaders together and he basically sets before them the most important of choices that anyone can ever make. Now, fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day who you are going to serve. Whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And you know, the way in which this choice is set before the people, I think, helps them to walk the path of how to make good choices. And it's worth just thinking of. You know, the first 13 verses of Joshua 24 is all about Joshua reminding the people of all the wonderful and amazing ways in which God had led them to that point. I suppose the key to it all is found in verses sort of 12 to 13. You know, you didn't do any of this with your own sword or with your bow. I gave you a land. You didn't toil for it. You didn't build the cities, but you live in them now and you eat from the vineyards. You have a harvest that you didn't plant. You've got things, and the only way you've got them is because I have blessed you with them. When the people obey God, when they choose God's way and God's will, they live a life fully able to experience and know the blessings of God. They have a land they hadn't worked for and cities they hadn't built and a harvest they didn't plant. Basically, what Joshua is reminding them is that all of our blessings are a God's gift to us. God gives us good gifts. And just as we thought last week when we named our blessings, one of the ways we can remain focused and keep healthy perspective in life, I think, is to remember what God has done. If not, we quite often just become moaning minis, if I'm honest. You know, because nothing's great and the world is difficult and we do have difficulties, but it's always good for us to remember what God has done for us. And how do we do it? Well, we read about the things that God has done for us within our scriptures. You know, you turn to the first chapter of Ephesians and you're reminded that you are blessed with every heavenly blessing. You're reminded that you are a child of God. You're reminded that you are loved for all eternity, forgiven, restored. You are reminded that your eternity is secure, not because you're clever and have done a lot, but because Jesus loves you and he died for you. We can remind ourselves of what God has done when we listen to one another's story. This is why sharing in church, like I know sometimes you don't like to do, is a good thing. It reminds us the things that God has done and is doing now in our lives. We can remind ourselves of the stories of faith that lay behind our church communities. You know, I was quite excited this week. I did a little bit of reading around the last revival that took place on English soil 100 years ago on the Suffolk coastline. So I have to give it to Suffolk this time. On the Suffolk coastline that spread all the way up the east coast, all the way up to Scotland, where they were having like 70 or 80 people coming to know Jesus every night because they'd got some bloke from Balham Baptist Church up to the Suffolk coast to do some preaching. You know, these stories are encouraging. They remind us of the things that God has done, that God can do, that God is still able to do in and amongst us. We look back to maybe those moments when we started to believe in Jesus, our moments of our baptism. You know, let us never, ever forget the things that God has done for us. Let us not be people that forget the blessings that we have been given. Joshua didn't forget what God had done. He didn't focus on what he'd done himself. He just focused on all that God had done, all that God was able to do. And as he does that, I think this choice is made because he really urges the people to get off the fence. He's urging them to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully. See, the biggest danger, I think, as Joshua had identified, wasn't that people wouldn't worship God. The biggest danger was that they were going to develop a religion that just mixed God in with all the other gods and all the other priorities of life in equal measure. Joshua is saying, don't mix different priorities. Don't serve two masters, is basically what he's saying. Fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped. Serve the Lord. You know, I think we live in a bit of a fence-walking world. Ours is a world that's grown quite comfortable, I think, with partial commitments. I think we all want to feel part of the game, but we just like the comfort of the stands, the comfort and the safety of the stands, shall we say. And what Joshua is showing here, that when it comes to making a good choice, actually what you need to do is get off the fence. You need to remember what God has done, but you have to be ready to get off the fence. You have to be ready to give the choice that you make 100% of all that you are. It's a precursor, really, to what Jesus says in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6. No one can serve two masters. You can't. And it might be one of the biggest dangers, I think, for us as Jesus followers today as well. It isn't that we reject Jesus outright, but that we become comfortable with just adding Jesus into our lives along with all the other priorities that we have. And he's just like any of the other priorities. We become comfortable with that. And in doing this, we run the risk of becoming neither really hot or really cold. We get to be just like that church in Laodicea, you know, lukewarm. And of course, we all know how detestable this is, as we hear Jesus say to them, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. In fact, I think the original language talks about I'm about to vomit you out, which I think is worse. It comes out with far more force. Take it from me as a nurse. It comes out with far more force. It's repulsed. It's just chucked out. Give your 100% devotion to God alone. If you're serious about God, Josh is saying, you need to get your backside off the fence. And of course, this backs up the next bit of his choice, really, which follows on from that. You have to choose to serve God alone. Because once you're off the fence, you have to keep making right choices. And of course, one of the choices you can make is that you sit back up on the fence again. The gods of the ancestors are mentioned, aren't they, in verse 14. The gods of Egypt are mentioned. The gods of the Amorites are mentioned. And these are the gods of the surrounding cultures. The things that others at the time would have seen acceptable and harmless, maybe a bit of superstitious fun, made sure that they covered all bases. You know, they kept right with all the gods. It was about temple, in these things related to rituals such as temple prostitution, child sacrifice, the worship of the sun and the moon and water and idols. And we all of a sudden, we go, well, we would never do that. That's horrendous things. But they were things that at the time were acceptable, and there are equivalents for us today. What Moses seems to want to communicate here is that a choice for God is a choice to not carry on with how things had been before. It is, I suppose, to highlight how crazy anything less than this really is. It's like saying, I choose and I've chosen to be married, but I will carry on living my everyday life as a single person in every way. It's ridiculous. You just can't. I wonder how much thought we might have given to this aspect of the choices we make, and especially the choice we make or have made with regard to our lives and following Jesus. You know, if we've said yes and chosen to follow Jesus, how is that choice evidenced in the way we now live? Or is our life just so overfull because Jesus has become just another equal priority duty or demander of time and energy and effort with everything else that we've crammed into our lives? Because we are in effect serving more than one God. In making good choices, Joshua shows the importance of remembering all that God has done, of being ready to get off the fence, of choosing to serve God alone. But I think also then highlighting that you have to choose to keep on keeping on with the decisions that you make. Once that choice is made, we have to walk the path that it opens for us. We have to stay on track. We have to stay focused so that we might finish well. That's what Joshua does here. He is showing us how we finish well. Our Christian life is a marathon. It isn't a sprint. And this is how the Apostle Paul sees it as well. In the New Testament, there are many verses that talk about it. 2 Timothy 4:7 about fighting the good fight and finishing the race. 1 Corinthians 9, running in such a way as to get the prize. Putting everything into it. Making your body, if you like, your slave, so that you continue to move forward, to grab hold of all of the things that God has grabbed hold of you for. Sometimes I think the biggest danger for us lies in keeping on with the choice we make to follow Jesus. I think it would be true to say that there are plenty of people who are ready to say they believe in God and believe in Jesus, but few are ready to say yes to being those who follow Jesus. And there's a difference. And I think this is what this story in Joshua and the following book of Judges tells us. That day at Shechem, there were loads of believers who said, yes, I believe God and I will serve him. And they were sincere, but they didn't then press on to take hold of all God had for them. Within one generation, they'd forgotten this commitment. They'd forgotten the choice that had been made. So I wonder this morning, how are you keeping on with the choice you made to follow Jesus? Or maybe I should ask, where is it a bit difficult at the minute? Because I'd be surprised if there wasn't some difficulty with it, because that's life. There was a story several years ago about twin sisters who had an alcoholic mother. And one of them became an alcoholic, and the other never touched the drink at all. And a relative went to the alcoholic daughter and said to her, why are you an alcoholic? And she said, well, my mother was an alcoholic, so what can you expect? But then asked the other daughter, who never touched the drink at all, why do you never touch the drink at all? And she said, well, my mother was an alcoholic. What do you expect? You see, the choice is ours. The choice is yours and the choice is mine. We can choose to obey God and to accept love and forgiveness and the life that Jesus makes possible for us, or we can choose to turn from all of that. And each one of us is responsible alone for the choices we make. Each one of us is. And we have to take responsibility for those choices, difficult as it is, because that's the way that it is. Joshua shows us in this passage that making good choices can be all about remembering what God has done for you, being ready to get off the fence, choosing to serve God alone, and choosing to keep on keeping on with that choice. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourself this day who you're going to serve. Whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you're living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Amen.